round 2 in the candidates tournament was as exciting as the first. I've already posted the game between Caruana and Alexienko. Do check that out. You can find the link in the I tab up there, or I think it's up there. Now I'd like to show you the game between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Ding Liren. Maxime, of course, was sprung into the tournament at the last minute replacement for Radjabov. And of course, without months for preparation, he had days, then it's really, well, who knows how he's going to perform. He had a reasonably solid draw in the first round. He had white against Caruana and, well, never looked in great difficulty. And now in round 2, he faces Ding Liren, who for many people is one of the favourites in the tournament. Certainly number 2 after Caruana. So it's a closed Spanish variation and H3. So this is an anti-martial system directed against D5 because, well, basically after white takes that pawn, white will still have the C3 square available for the knight. So bishop B7 and D3. So this is typical of these anti-martial systems, this solid pawn chain through the middle. And it looks as though white has nothing here, but actually there is a difference between the two positions. This bishop on B3 is simply more active than its counterpart on B7, which hits, well, that well-protected pawn. One can play D5 here with black, which of course leads to enormous complications. Well, Maxime had exactly that move against Wesley So. So, Maxime would be prepared for that. But Ding keeps more tension with D6. And A3. Now that the pawn is protected, of course, black was then threatening to move the knight to exchange off that powerful bishop. So all very kind of orthodox so far. Again, it feels as though, how can white possibly claim an advantage here? But like I said, that bishop, it's actually rather annoying. Ding has previously faced knight d5 here, but bishop d2 from Maxime. Okay, this is a typical move in these variations, looking to take some kind of control over these squares. Now knight d8 from Ding. If the knight bounces around here, then it looks like a reasonable square, and perhaps he's looking to advance this c-pawn as well. Knight d5, a slightly unusual move in this exact position, but of course a very common move in these anti-martial positions. And because the bishop on e7 is under attack, then really black should exchange off that knight. So knight takes knight and pawn takes. Now, obviously, the pawn structure has changed after that exchange. It's a bit annoying for white that the bishop is now blocked. However, that pawn on d5 is potentially very useful. You can see that the knight now has no decent move to make. That pawn controls these squares, and that's very annoying for black. Then again, if black can get these pawns rolling down the board, then there's potentially, now that e-pawn, white's e-pawn has disappeared, then there's potential for black to roll those kingside pawns down the board. And of course, particularly if the f-pawn moves, then the knight will find a square on f7. But in the meantime, white has some initiative on the queen side, and it's that pawn which allows white to chip away at black's position, as we're about to see. c5 was played, which MVL said afterwards was a little bit surprising. Of course, black can play c6 here, and then c4 and a4. Basically, white is trying to open some lines on the queen side, while black still has to redeploy that knight. But c5. And again, white plays a4, and it's not easy for black to meet this, actually, because of that knight, which just stands like a useless piece of furniture in the middle of the room. It can't move. It breaks the connection between the rooks. You know what I'm going to say. Split rooks, they're not good. So black has to work hard here to coordinate his position. Now, this has been seen before. f6 played, which looks a bit funny. Supporting the pawn on e5, is that really necessary? Well, actually, we're about to see it is. And then the knight will come to f7, and it's not too bad for black. If b4, which feels like black wants to close things, but actually that's difficult after this move, or a5 and then c3. So white will be able to advance these pawns and play bishop a4, and then get some initiative on the b file. That bishop on b7 is a poor piece. So a4 anyway has just been played by white, and f5 by Ding. Now, he thought for almost 10 minutes over this move, and it's a very loose move. Well, you can see straight away that tactics might be possible on this diagonal. Now, immediately it's not possible to take on e5, because in this position, yes, that's check, but actually here is quite promising for black. Maxime took on b5 first and exchanged rooks. Good idea, because it means that that bishop is really shut out of the game. It's going to take some time before it bounces around to see it. And let's just confirm that knight takes e5. It simply doesn't work here. d6 check from the bishop on b3. Black plays the pawn to c4. White takes the bishop on e7. Pawn takes bishop on b3. Yes, the knight can be taken, but you can see that the pawn on d3 is being undermined here, and well, basically black is fine. So we're in this position. So instead of knight takes e5, but watch out for that, Maxime played c4. Very good move. And this is really problematic for black. I mean, it doesn't feel like it should be, but actually there are tactical elements here which all come together for white. So first things first, pawn takes pawn can be met by bishop a4, winning material. So that's the essential problem. That's one of the tactics in the position, this skewer. If black plays the rook to the side to try and avoid that, then white can take on b5. And if queen takes pawn, now there's no longer a skewer here. However, that's when the tactics come into play on this diagonal. So then we can play knight takes pawn. And d6 check, and you can see there's no block with c4, so the bishop on b3 checks the king, and pawn takes bishop simply wins material. So these are the two tactical problems. Isn't it interesting again that we see this bishop on b3, that Spanish bishop, with tactics on both these diagonals? How often do you see it, that bishop, the light squared bishop in the Spanish, really comes into its own? So Ding had to compromise here. He played the knight off the back rank, but then simply pawn takes pawn, and Maxime had won a pawn. Queen takes, and we have this skewer again. Now, you could argue that maybe this isn't the best pawn in the world. Nevertheless, it's going to be protected, and we're going to be able to play b4 potentially. And it's a decent passed pawn. In the meantime, there's also moves like queen a1 to try and get in here. And unless black can get rid of the pawn on d5, which seems unlikely, then white is actually doing pretty well. And I think that's what Ding feared, that actually he couldn't see any decent counterplay. And that's why he lashed out with g5. But this makes things even worse. The problem is, again, it's that bishop in the corner. It really needs to be on c8 to cover some important light squares here. And watch how Maxime deals with this. The knight comes back to h2, so the queen looks out on this diagonal. And that's a problem. I mean, you can see how the initiative could easily swing over towards white on the king side with that queen in the heart of black's king position. And that's why the king stepped up the board. So Maxime protected that pawn. You can see, I mean, these pawns look a little bit ugly. Actually, that bishop does a great job of protecting them and can't be shifted. King g6, wow. So he wants to maybe get in h5 and g4 and stuff, but g4, it's really strong. And again, we come back to the fact that these light squares on the king side are terribly weak. And it's just really difficult for black to remedy this problem. And white is going to take the initiative. I mean, given a couple of free moves, we'd play knight f1, back to g3, and suddenly black's position is just caving in. So knight h6 from Ding. And now there are many ways to play, but Maxime went with queen f3, very pragmatic, very solid, bringing the queen over into, you know, the important zone around the kings. And queen g2. So he now potentially threatens to open up the position to get an attack here. Now, this is where Ding played the pawn to f4, but I think that makes life just too easy for white, because the position completely closes on the king side. However dangerous it might have been, I think he had to play bishop b7. Now here, white has, well, several very attractive options. You could take here and start attacking like this. You could play in a really flashy way, b4, and then d4, in order to bring the light squared bishop back to attack the king, for example. I mean, it looks really flashy. It's probably good for white, but it's a bit tricky. I mean, one could, in this position after bishop b7, simply play bishop takes b4. This is by far the most sensible move, of course. And it's a clear pawn up for white, and it feels as though any move that black makes with this pawn just leaves his king really open. So basically white is in control. Anyway, back to reality, back to the game. Ding played pawn to f4. So the king side closes, and now Maxime has a free hand on the other side of the board. And if that pawn is taken, well, in fact, white switches back to the king side. And then knight d4 is a really nice variation with that knight about to hop in here. It looks absolutely dreadful. Of course, there's a pin. If pawn takes knight, then queen takes rook. Okay, back to the game. White has just played b4. Bishop b6. A check in the middle. And an exchange of pawns on c5. Now, of course, one would want to play bishop takes pawn on c5, but d4 again exploits this pin. If bishop takes, then knight f3 threatens knight takes bishop, also threatens knight takes g5 with complete destruction of the king side. So after pawn takes pawn, Ding had to recapture with the pawn, which is just dreadful, because now this pawn is weak. It's just a miserable position. So the pawn has been held, but white is in complete control. Here's a nice move, b6. So if that's taken, then knight takes pawn, and bishop b8. This is the game continuation. Queen f5 from Maxime. Really interesting move. You know, he could have played in a flashier way, but he just thought, okay, I'm in control in this position. There is no need to do anything that's going to jeopardize this. It's these pieces, they're still absolutely dreadful on the queen side. And the knight spun back to d2. Now Maxime said he'd actually overlooked this move. So black wants to take here. And he was looking at variations like b7 and rook b1, targeting those pieces. But he was worried that black would be able to give up a piece. Now, I think white still is winning this, but the variation that he saw was this, which is indeed not so clear. Black is picking up a lot of pawns here for the piece. I mean, there are alternatives there for white. But anyway, he found a really nice move here for white. He gave up that d-pawn, pawn to d6. And it's a beautiful move, actually. It just opens up white's pieces wonderfully. So, for example, if knight takes d6, then the bishop no longer covers here, and the king is just cut to pieces here. If bishop takes d6, then rook a1 is actually very annoying for black. Sorry, let me just go back and move. Well, I can show you. King takes pawn simply isn't possible here because of bishop takes knight. And that's one of the reasons why d6 was played, actually. And here, white just has an overwhelming positional advantage, basically. You can see this, dare I say it again, this wonderful Spanish bishop, you know, controls all these squares, and rook a7 coming. It's just wonderful position to play. d6 just played. Rook takes d6. And now the rook came across, threatening b7, of course. Now the best that black has is to play bishop c6, and once again we have this highly unpleasant position. Black is positionally lost. Let me just show you one variation, which is very attractive. Rook a1. So the rook wants to come in. Rook takes pawn. Has white blown things? Absolutely not. Just watch what happens. This piece is so poorly placed. Bishop here. We take, and now rook b7 attacks the bishop and threatens rook f7 mate. It never rains, it pours. Just everything is working in white's favour. It's down to the bishop again. Okay, let me come back. So rook b1 has just been played, and in fact knight d8 was played, and now lovely tactics. b7, very typical of Maxime. I've mentioned this before, he's a real expert in endgame studies. So he spots, you know, little tactical motifs very quickly and study-like finishes. And this is actually a beautiful way to finish the game. So if knight takes pawn, then you can see the bishop has been blocked, and we play knight e4 check forking king and rook. In the game, bishop takes was played, but bishop a5 is a very neat winning move. The threat is to play bishop takes knight, followed by rook takes bishop. If that bishop moves, well then the other bishop is vulnerable. You can see that all black's minor pieces are vulnerable here. They all lack the support of a pawn and they tread on each other's toes. And basically there's no way out. Black cannot avoid losing material. Beautiful game by Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and he said after the game that he felt very fresh. That, well, in the last couple of months, he's managed to relax a lot. He, took some time out. He had an exhausting 2019, but he feels really relaxed, really fresh. And, well, it shows in his play and his attitude so far. I feel really sorry for Ding. He's lost his first 2 games, and you just have to wonder whether the whole situation with the coronavirus is affecting him. I hope that he comes back. But anyway, in the meantime, I'm delighted that Maxime Vachier-Lagrave has won his first game in the candidates.